My name is Jessica Knapp, and I am the Online Engagement Coordinator for Canada's History Society. The Treaties and the Treaty Relationship webinar series is a collaboration between Canada's History Society and the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. So I am happy to have here with us today both Amanda, who's the Education Manager of the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, and Cynthia Bird, who is our presenter today and was integral in the creation of the Treaty Education Initiative, which we will hear more about on November 9th from Connie Wyatt Anderson, who is the second half of that team. Connie is with us here as well. There are many friends of Canada's history in today's audience, so I welcome you all and all of our new friends who have joined us as well. Thank you for being here, and I hope today's presentation is that either that starting point or that inspiration to continue your treaty education, whether it's for the workplace, the school, or just your personal interest. We're happy to have every single one of you here with us. So the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba is a neutral body created through a partnership between the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs and Canada, with a mandate to strengthen, rebuild, and enhance the treaty relationship and mutual respect between First Nations and Manitobans, as envisaged by the treaty parties. For more information on the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, please go to trcm.ca. And I'm just sharing it with you all in the chat room right now, so you can save that link and check out their website later. Jennifer, I see your question. There is no video at this time. So a little bit about Canada's history. Canada's History Society is dedicated to promoting greater popular interest in Canadian history, principally through our publishing, education, and recognition programs. To learn more about Canada's History Society, you can go to www.canadashistory.ca, or if you would prefer in French, www.histoirecanada.ca. The choice is yours. So both Canada's History Society and the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba are on social media. If you're interested in extending today's conversation on Facebook or Twitter, feel free to mention us or use the hashtag Treaty History. So on this current screen, you can see both our Twitter handles for Canada's History at Canada's History, and for the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba at MB Treaty. Tag either of us, use the hashtag, the choice is yours. We will be very happy to see this conversation grow from this room on social media platforms. So have at it. For the best experience possible today, I do encourage you to close down any unnecessary programs your computer may be running, like Photoshop or Spotify. However, if there are technical issues today, there will be a recording of today's webinar available in a few days. And if you have registered, you will receive an email when that recording becomes available. That recording will be hosted on YouTube, but it will also be accessible through Canada's History and the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba websites. So if you have any questions during the webinar, you are welcome to ask them at any time. Cynthia is just a wonderful woman and a wonderful educator and a wonderful speaker. Cynthia Bird is a Cree educator from the Peguis First Nation in Manitoba and Treaty 1 territory. She has 34 years of work experience in community education, research involving urban Aboriginal homelessness, Indigenous curriculum development, and group facilitation processes. Her education journey has included traditional and non-traditional settings, working with elders, various education institutions, not-for-profit organizations, and First Nation communities and organizations in Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario. Cynthia began her work with the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba in 2009 as the lead and principal writer for the Treaty Education Initiative. In recognition of her accomplishments and contributions to treaty education, she received the Aboriginal Circle of Educators Research and Curriculum Development Award in 2011 and the Treaty Advocacy Award from the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba in 2014. Currently, she is advisor to the Treaty Education Initiative and lives in Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, where she works as an independent consultant. We are very pleased to have Cynthia with us here today. Please join me in welcoming Cynthia.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see so many people from across the country from different traditional territories. So welcome to the webinar. And as Jessica's uploading the presentation, I will put my webcam on so you can just see me for a few minutes. So the presentation today, I have about 20 to 25 minutes, and then with the Q&A. What we're focusing on today is treaty making and the significance of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So I'm hoping you're as excited as I get about treaty history and the significance of historical documents like the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and their significance to the treaties that are in place today. So with that, I am going to move to my next frame here. We're hoping that that the information I share with you today will give you a foundational introduction to the series on the treaties and the treaty relationship over the next 5 sessions following this one. So I'm going to just stop my webcam and just continue with my presentation. So I think it's important that we consider what is a treaty, just to give ourselves a frame of reference. And you know, when you go to any dictionary, these are some of the definitions that you'll find, including one that you'll find on the Treaty Relations Commission website. A treaty, a formally concluded and ratified agreement between countries. A treaty is an agreement in written form between nation states, and that's so important in the context of treaty making in Canada for the First Nations treaty making process with the Crown, and that is intended to establish a relationship governed by international law. A treaty is a negotiated agreement that clearly spells out the rights, responsibilities, and relationships of First Nations, and in this case, the federal and provincial governments, because of the delegation of authority that has happened over the years in this country. So in our languages, in our First Nation languages, the words, of course, are different because there's so many nations across the country. And just to give you a couple of examples that are grounded in the history of Manitoba, we have the Ojibwe word for treaties, Aguwid Diwin. And Elder Bone tells us that that word means putting things together, bringing things together, and it was indicative of the time when the two parties were coming together to talk about forming an agreement, forming a relationship. In the Cree language, the word is Ichiogamasqueo Usatama Iwen, the Queen promises. And so that's a very powerful description of what treaties are, and that distinct relationship and their unique relationship between First Nations peoples and the Crown. So that just gives you an idea of some of the translation. Oh, I'm just popping ahead here too fast. Okay, so what I've provided here is a pre-contact map of North America, just to give you an idea of what the country looked like, the continent looked like before contact. And as you look at this map, you can see there are many different geographic regions and nations occupying the space in North America, or Turtle Island, as many of our people refer to it as. So it was not new the concept of treaty making to our people in order to coexist with so many multiple diverse nations. Of course, there had to be practical processes in place to be able to share the land and the resources, and also for trade purposes. So treaty making in North America really did have its roots in the historical relationship that First Nations had with each other. In addition, there were protocols that were in place that they practiced each time they came together. And it's these treaty making protocols that were adopted by early explorers, the fur traders, and others who entered into First Nations lands. Because very quickly they learned that they have to follow the protocols, have to respect the protocols, and within that begin to share a little bit of their own culture in that process. So some of the very foundational protocols that remained through these eras uh, included ceremony. And that ceremony, in most cases, was a pipe ceremony that solidified the party's spirit and intent to the agreements and to the relationship that they were forming. So it not only included the First Nation peoples, but the other party, whether it was the early explorers, the fur traders, or the Queen's representative, and the creator or the god that the other people had prayed to. So in having these parties part of that ceremony, it was very much a very solemn agreement that were being formed each time such a ceremony took place. As part of those protocols, too, there was gift giving and exchanges. Both parties exchanged those kinds of gifts with each other, and gifts that represented not only the relationship but the various cultures that were present at those times. And then there was the celebration of the agreement and the relationship that was being formed through a feasting process. And this took time. It was not something that happened in a couple hours as we do today to try to run very expedient and efficient meetings. It was time that was taken to develop a bit of a relationship. So it was over a period of days that these discussions happened, and sometimes weeks as you got further into more complex negotiations. Now, the Royal Proclamation itself is a key document to treaty making history in Canada. If most of you, or a large number of you, are part of the Canada Historical Society, so you would know the significance of the Royal Proclamation of 1763 in history. But for First Nations people and the Crown, it is a critical document. It's a document that was issued by King George III following the Seven Years' War. And in that document, it outlined a treaty making process between First Nations people and the Crown. In that document, it set out conditions as well under which First Nation lands could be acquired, and very clearly processes were outlined, which we'll have a look at a little bit later in the next frame. But the objective of the Royal Proclamation was to restore peaceful relations after this long war that had taken place over that 7-year period, and to reassure First Nations um, about their lands. There was a lot of encroachment happening, a lot of land deals going on during that time. People from the south, in particular, wanting to come north to acquire First Nation lands, and other colonial parties as well. So it was important that some order be restored to this process, and the British felt it was their duty and in their interest to come forward with such a process. So they really the Royal Proclamation was really looking to establish a long-standing process for treaty making to acquire lands. And we have to remember that the Royal Proclamation is a British document, so it's a crown document, and it was created for their interest, of course. and it covered a large portion of North America in the northeastern part of the country. So today, the relevance of that proclamation remains when our governments and the legal parties look to try to establish certain legal and political principles upon which treaty making processes were established, and they look at the Royal Proclamation for this. So if we look at some specific clauses of the Royal Proclamation that have come to be referred to in literature as the Indian clauses, using the colonial term Indian. These are a few clauses, 3 clauses that I'd just like to highlight with you. The first one, as the proclamation begins, it says, "And whereas it is just and reasonable and essential to our interest and the security of our colonies that several nations or tribes of Indians with whom we are connected and who live under our protection should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of our dominion and territories as, not having been ceded to or purchased by us, are reserved to them or any of them as their hunting grounds." And the importance of this clause is that the Royal Proclamation recognized First Nations people as nations. And that's a key piece and very fundamental to the concept that treaties were made between nations. And when we think about the original history of this country, yes, First Nations occupied this country, this land, as did the British nation occupy their land in England, in the West, and the French, etc. So the other recognition in this clause is that the British government had made a promise to First Nation people that they had already encountered through their contact prior to 1763, and they had made promises to protect First Nations people, and now this document solidified that and announced that protection, and gave them a document to refer to as having entered into that relationship. And they used language in the proclamation like ceded or purchased. And those pieces of language are important for the government as well as for First Nations, because First Nations, if we had written this document, it would talk about sharing the land and sharing the resources. The other piece to this clause talks about reserving lands for First Nations and recognition of hunting grounds. Traditional rights are included in this clause. The next clause that's a significant one that's often referred to is the one about the frauds and abuses that were taking place during this time. And whereas, it reads, "Great frauds and abuses have been committed in purchasing land of the Indians, to the great prejudice of our interests and the great dissatisfaction of the said Indians." So in this clause, there's a recognition that the land belonged to First Nations people, to the First Nations plural, because there are many nations across the country. And the British also were very quick in this document to say that it was in their interest, that they were not happy that this was happening, that it was being agreements were being made with other parties other than the British Crown, and they had already heard of the dissatisfaction from many First Nations about the frauds and abuses that were happening. A third clause reads, "No private person do assume to make any purchase from the said Indians of any lands reserved to the said Indians within those parts of our colonies where we have thought proper to allow settlement, but that if at any time of the said Indians should be inclined to dispose of lands, the same shall be purchased only for us and in our name at some public meeting or assembly of said Indians." So this clause is important because it looks at the British people being the ones that can purchase land from First Nations people. And the only way they can do that is at a public meeting or an assembly of the First Nations so that discussions could happen, right? And the negotiations could take place. So when we look at the pieces of the Royal Proclamation and the context of how that came to be important to treaty making, we can see that it had a profound impact on the colonial developments of this country, and some of these consequences are still felt today because in many of the talks of our people, but also in court cases, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 is still something that's referred to and brought forward as having significance, particularly because it recognized that First Nations people lived on traditional lands, and it was in the interest of those lands belonged to groups and nations, not individuals, but groups and nations of people, First Nations people. And the Crown, or in this case Canada, of course, as represented by Canada, required an agreement with First Nations people to acquire lands from them through a public meeting of their people. First Nations people also held title to their land unless they surrendered it. And I think it's key again to acknowledge the word surrendered. That again is from the Crown perspective. Because First Nations did not understand that they were surrendering or ceding any of their land or resources, but rather sharing it for the common good of all peoples. First Nation peoples under the Crown would be under the Crown and Canada's protection. So these are some of the key pieces and that give significance to the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and really provide founding principles for all future treaties for land in colonies and in Canada. So the protocols as well that were combined with the Royal Proclamation of 1763 included the First Nations already established protocols that we talked about earlier in treaty making processes, but these came together to shape all future treaty making involving First Nations peoples and other peoples in this country. Oh, I'm zipping ahead here again. Just going back. So that was in 1763, the Royal Proclamation, but a significant gathering happened at the Treaty of Niagara in the summer of 1764. A large gathering, or in this case, assembly, if you were to interpret the Royal Proclamation, a large public meeting or an assembly of over 2,000 First Nation leaders came together, representing at least 24 different nations, convened a meeting at Niagara, a place known as the Crooked Place by First Nations who lived in that territory and traveled through that place. So this large meeting was convened with Crown representatives for the purpose, again, of establishing an agreement specifically for free trade, safe passage into the interior, peaceful relations, mutual support, peaceful settlement, and promising no encroachments as well onto First Nations lands that weren't already shared with other parties such as the Crown. So at this gathering, you can imagine 2,000 First Nation leaders and representatives of the Crown being present. That language would be an issue. So, because we have many different First Nation languages, and some of our people, of course, had fluency in English, but not everyone. But it came to be a common language of treating at that time through that as well as through First Nation languages through interpreters. So at this Treaty of Niagara, they did come up with a covenant chain wampum. And for those of you that know what wampum is, it's a diplomatic device that our people have used for many centuries that really outlines relationships and agreements that were being made and how that would be preserved, maintained, and perpetuated through the oral tradition when the parties came together. So this wampum symbolized friendship and alliance between First Nation leaders and the Crown. And it's interesting that this Treaty of Niagara was celebrated again just a couple years ago when First Nation leaders convened at Niagara. So it was an exciting time in our very recent history to see leadership come together again to talk to that wampum and to tell the story about the Treaty of Niagara and the time when when the parties came together to make this friendship and alliance. So the Royal Proclamation really did guide the Treaty of Niagara negotiations at that time. So together, when we think about the significance of not only the Royal Proclamation, it represented a fundamental document, but the Treaty of Niagara a year later represented a fundamental agreement of how the principles of the Royal Proclamation were being implemented and actualized in a formal treaty. When we look forward from that date, from the Royal Proclamation of 1763, um, and following the Treaty of Niagara in 1764, we see the Royal Proclamation guidelines for treaty making being followed all through the years, through the pre-Confederation treaty period from 1724, which predates the Royal Proclamation, right, to 1854. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Post-Confederation treaties from 1871, and that was the beginning of the numbered treaties. Treaty 1, the territory that I'm from, which was signed in 1871 up until 1923. And then the modern day treaties that started in 1975 with the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement, and which continues to this day with treaties in the very north and treaties to the west of us in British Columbia. When we look at the map of treaties in Canada, it's important to remember that what we are looking at are agreements that were made between First Nations people and the Crown, not Aboriginal people and the Crown. If you know your definitions of the legal terms that Canada is currently using to describe who Indigenous people are in this country, they were using Aboriginal up until the Trudeau government, now using Indigenous, but that's still an inclusive term. That includes First Nation peoples, Métis peoples, and Inuit peoples. So in this context, we are looking at treaties that were in Canada that were made between First Nation peoples and the Crown. And I think that's a very important point to remember when we talk about treaties. So when we look at the map of Canada, you will see the pre-Confederation treaties, the post-Confederation treaties signed here. And if you're looking at starting in the east, 1925 to 1779, we have a number of the early friendship treaties that were signed. Then we go, if you scoot quickly to the far west, you see pre-Confederation treaties at the Vancouver Island treaties. And those were in a very short period of time, around 1850 to 1854. And then we have a number of other treaties around the Great Lakes area. We're looking at the Upper Canada treaties, the Robinson-Huron, the Williams Treaty, and so on. As we're moving to the west, we finally get to the chunk of the western provinces, being the northwest part of Ontario into the very northeast part of BC and north into the Northwest Territories area. There we see from 1871 to 1930 the number of treaties were made along with a number of adhesions. So I've had the pleasure of living in a number of different treaty territories, and right now I'm in Treaty 7, I have a lot to learn yet about Treaty 7. I have been a guest here since 2004. So I would hope when you look at the map, you would see yourself in one of these treaty regions and know which treaty territory you are living in and you belong to or you are a guest. So when we talk about treaties in its contemporary context, uh, it's important for us to think about who benefits from treaties. There continues to be a myth in in Canada and other places that treaties, the people who benefit from treaties are First Nations peoples. Well, that's true. We do benefit, but it benefits all Canadians. The original treaty parties benefited in the terms of First Nations people that got annuities and other benefits, recognition of treaty and hunting rights, gathering rights, trapping, etc., and to continue their own traditional lifestyles, for example. Those were benefits of the treaty making process. But the Crown at that time also got benefits, and that was access to land and resources. And it was the basis of that Johnny MacDonald was able to advance his national policy so quickly as we see the numbered treaties being signed very successively from 1871, 72, 73, and so on. Very quickly, this series of numbered treaties were signed as the rush to access Western Canada was important in tying the East Coast to the West Coast. So today, we all benefit from this treaty agreement, the historic treaty agreement and relationship that was formed with First Nations people and the Crown. And with that, we carry responsibilities and obligations as Canadians. And when we think about our citizenship, First Nations citizenship, we some people will claim dual citizenship or more if they have relations across the medicine line or the U.S. Canada border. So our identities are very complex in terms of First Nation identities, and that's another topic. But in terms of the benefits of treaties, it's important to realize that all Canadians benefit uh, from from the treaties. So what does that mean today? I think it's important in our history. We finally have an opportunity to bring some social justice to history, and it's been only in the very recent history that has opened up to acknowledge that we have a shared history, and there are many voices in that shared history. And one of the voices that has been absent for a very long time has been the First Nations voice. And we are so thankful that there's some openness these days to wanting to learn the First Nation perspective about history and our experiences here in Canada, particularly the treaty making experience, because treaties are the building blocks of this country. Without treaties, the British Crown would not have been able to acquire lands in accordance with the Royal Proclamation of 1763. They would not have been able to acquire alliances and friendships, to have a plan and an agreement in place for peaceful coexistence. So really, treaties as the fundamental building blocks of Canada were a way of ensuring the well-being of both parties to the agreements through economic and political means. And the treaties, as I mentioned earlier, they established this long-standing peaceful coexistence between First Nations and the Crown that continues to this day. Thank goodness we haven't had any wars. So what is a treaty right? We hear about treaty rights. A treaty right is a collective entitlement derived from a treaty. So for example, I am from Treaty 1. I'm a descendant. My ancestors were part of Treaty 1 that was signed in 1871 at Lower Fort Garry. Therefore, I carry that collective entitlement as a treaty person to annuities every year, I have a right to health as well, to education. I have a right to practice traditional hunting, trapping if I wanted to, fishing, etc. So that's part of a collective treaty entitlement. Um, and when we talk about annuities, I think it's important just to quickly touch on that piece. You know, the annuity is $5. And economically, today, that doesn't sound like a lot of money, but that $5 is more symbolic than anything of that historical relationship between First Nations peoples and the Crown. So when we take the $5 each year from the Crown, that's usually given to us by the hand of an Indian agent represented by an employee from Indigenous Affairs and Northern Development Canada, uh, witnessed by the RCMP, who are there for peace and goodwill. Uh, we are taking that $5 on behalf of our ancestors and acknowledging that historical relationship that we have as a First Nation treaty person with the Crown, that unique relationship. So, but out of that too, like Canadians also have rights. We don't call them treaty rights, but they do have rights that come from the Crown entering into treaties. And early on, these rights were the right to settle and make a living on the land. And that still exists today. And that includes new Canadians that come to this country, that come to Canada and have a right to buy land and settle where they would like to or where they are able to and make a life for themselves. So what is the treaty relationship? As I mentioned, the historical treaty relationship, that's an important piece to acknowledge when we talk about treaties and the treaty relationship, that it's this historical treaty relationship between First Nations peoples and the Crown, as represented by Canada now, was a foundational piece to the treaty relationships that all Canadians have today as an extension of this historic treaty relationship. So we all benefit from treaties and that relationship that was established early on. And that's why we promote the slogan, "We are all treaty people," to try to promote that understanding of our shared history and the foundational piece that brought us to this day, 2016, and will carry us into the future. Why are treaties important to Canadian history? It's important for Canadians, our children, and other peoples, and through a public education process, to teach how important treaties are as a foundation for the historic treaty relationship. To teach that treaties are fundamental building blocks of Canada as a country. And to teach what treaties meant to the Crown at that time. That the Crown, as represented by Canada, was able to gain peaceful access to lands for settlement and occupation from coast to coast. If we flip back to that frame of the pre-contact North America, it looks quite different today, doesn't it, if there was an overlap of the provincial boundaries? Very, very different. And for our people, we recognize those boundaries, but we also still recognize our traditional territorial boundaries that cross the provincial boundaries we see today on the current Manitoba map. So treaties really did establish treaty benefits for First Nations peoples, the Crown and its citizens, all citizens, past, present, and moving forward into the future. If I were to tell you what is important to remember about treaties and the treaty relationship, I would say all these things written on this sheet, on this frame, and it's quite lengthy, but we've touched on a number of them already. You know, a significant piece is to remember that treaties were signed between First Nation peoples and the Crown as represented by Canada. And to remember the significance of the Royal Proclamation of 1763 in that process, which outlined guidelines for treaty making. If some of you look at Supreme Court of Canada cases today, there are cases that will go back to the Royal Proclamation of 1763. There are other significant initiatives that have happened in this country, like the Royal Commission for Aboriginal Peoples that acknowledges the importance of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. The Truth and Reconciliation report that's out also acknowledges the importance of the Royal Proclamation. So it's significant. And it would be good to read a little bit more. And I do have a reading list for you if you want some nighttime reading about treaties and their significance in Canada. The other piece, though, was that the Treaty of Niagara 1764, you will hear more of our people talking about that gathering as it being significant to actualizing the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and implementing those treaty-making guidelines. Also, it's important to remember that treaties are solemn agreements, sacred covenants. And we say this because of the nature of time that it took to make these agreements, that it did take time, days, sometimes weeks, and sometimes second visits over time to conclude these agreements. And in that process, all those protocols were being used, for example, like the pipe ceremony, where the Creator or God was present to witness the parties make these agreements and promises to each other and to accept responsibility for upholding them over time and into the future. I mentioned a number of other things as we're going along here already talked about, but it's important to also be familiar with the term that treaties are evergreen. They're historical living documents that continue to have application not only to our present, but will continue to have into our future. And it's also important to realize that all contemporary treaty issues are related to treaties and this historic treaty relationship. It's now complicated with subsequent Canadian legislation and policies, so there's a lot of complications with new legislation and policies that have come into place. A key piece to remember is that the Indian Act is not part of the treaties. It is not part of the treaties. Indian Act is not part of the treaties. I can't say it enough. It is a Canadian government policy that people put together to manage the outcome of treaties. But it is not part of treaties. The oral tradition and the written word are very much intrinsic to understanding treaties and historic relationship. And in this context, it's really important to put on our historical thinking hats and ask ourselves, how do we decide what and whose stories to tell? And if we're reading something or listening to someone talk, it's important to ask, like, whose voice am I listening to? Whose truth am I listening to? And where does that information come from? And treaty education in this process is critical. We believe, to establishing and creating understanding and appreciation for our shared history, but the significance and importance of treaties and this treaty relationship as we continue to live together and go forward. Oops. I just want to go back and touch on the references and further reading here. I think you will find these readings interesting. Some of them are just chapters and not whole books unless you want to read the whole book. John Burroughs did a piece on the wampum at Niagara, which speaks to the Royal Proclamation, Canadian legal history and self-government. And that's a very good piece to have a look at. INAC revised their history of treaty making in Canada in 2010, and I like some of the revisions that they've made in this document. Miller's book on compact, contract, and covenant is about treaty making. Now, he uses the term Aboriginal treaty making. That's important to look at when you're reading that, to see, is he talking about treaties with First Nations, or is he talking about treaties with Métis? I only know of treaties with First Nations, so that's what I'm speaking to you about today. And Nathan Tidridge, who talks about the Treaty of Niagara again and the covenant chain of friendship. The TRCM, Treaty Elders Volumes 1 to 3, is a recording of oral histories, so I think that's important, and so on. I will just leave that with you, and I will thank you for listening to me, and hope that you have a few questions, and I will try to answer them. So I really appreciate your time. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Thank you, everyone in the room with us now. Thank you, Cynthia, for your very detailed and consistent presentation. We do have a few questions trickling in, and I have some questions myself. We'll start with Trina, who is wondering if you can expand on what our treaty and adhesion is. She says, my First Nation is part of an adhesion to Treaty 5, but she has never been sure what that means.
Okay, treaty adhesions. Can everybody hear me? I'm hoping everybody, okay, good. Yes, treaty adhesions. What that means is the original treaty was signed at a particular time. An assembly was called, a meeting was called of First Nations, but not everyone that were members could attend and be in that space at that time. So we had leadership that assumed those roles and signed a treaty. For example, Treaty 5 we'll use, and then later on, the commissioners were obligated to go out into other territories within those regions to talk to those First Nations who weren't able to be present. And usually what happened at those times, but some of the leadership who were present at the original signing went to the second and third meetings called adhesions to share the truths of the agreement that were made. And this happened in a number of different treaty areas. I hope that helps. You can visit also the Treaty Relations Commission website. That'll give you some more specific information.
Thank you, Cynthia. The next question we've received is from Les McCann, who would like to hear a little bit more about what you mean by sharing from a First Nations perspective. I believe earlier in your presentation you commented that if the Royal Proclamation was written by a First Nations person or people, you would have used the term sharing. If you could just give us a perspective on that.
Okay, yes. So the sharing, what First Nations understand in terms of sharing the land and resources, what that means is equally benefiting from the land and resources. And if we look at what that means today, and we look at the resources that are being extracted from our original lands, how much of that are we benefiting from? Are we equal partners in that process? No, we are not. Yes, in some parts of the country where there's Indian oil and gas, for example, operating, there are some other benefits that membership are receiving in the form of royalties, but in many other cases, there are not. First Nations are not benefiting as equally as envisioned by the parties at that time. And in the case of land as well, the reserves are quite small. If you were to look at the polka dots and the pinpoints across the country, the sizes of the reserves are very small compared to the original lands that people had. So there wasn't a lot of sharing as envisioned what it could and should have looked like at that time. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Cynthia. Vivian asks, which parts of Canada did not sign treaties and why not? BC, question mark. And Marlene furthers that and asks, also Yukon and the North, question mark, question mark.
Okay. I'm still learning about the parties that did not sign treaties, but definitely into BC there are nations that did not sign treaties, and some of them are becoming part of the modern treaties today. So it's something that that you could research and look under the BC Treaty Commission. That's an excellent resource. It's a political body that looks at the negotiations and the complexities of treaties and that whole treaty making process in that territory.
Thanks, Cynthia. Anne Anderson has a question. Have all treaties been cataloged, or do you think there are treaties that have or that are lost in the archives and not discovered yet?
I think the only treaties that are cataloged are the ones that the Canadian government recognize. And they have stated that they recognize 70 uh, pre-Confederation and post-Confederation treaties and 24 modern-day treaties. That does not include treaties like the Selkirk Treaty of 1817 that occurred in Manitoba at that time, which my ancestors were part of. With the Lord Selkirk, who wanted to establish a Scottish colony in the area just around Winnipeg. That's not acknowledged as a treaty. And very recently, the Murray Treaty of 1760, the Huron-Murray Treaty of 1760, was recognized only in 1990 as a valid treaty with some significance to present day. So I think we have a lot to learn and a lot to uncover yet in our shared history.
Thank you. I do want to share with everybody now a link in the chat box, which is a link to a survey, feedback survey about your experience in today's webinar. Please take a few minutes and let us know what you thought. Have a wonderful afternoon or evening wherever you are in Canada, and thank you once again. Cynthia, I will ask you a few more questions if that's okay with you. Does every province and territory have a treaty commission?
That is a very good question. No, not every province has a treaty commission. We've had the BC Treaty Commission has been in existence for a very long time, over 20 years, and then the Office of the Treaty Commissioner in Saskatchewan was established just over 20 years as well, followed by the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba in 2009. And those are the only commissions that I'm aware of in Canada. There's discussions in Alberta. The nations are looking at the possibility of a treaty commission. So there's still a lot of discussions happening. And the government as well is looking at what they believe is the value of treaty commissions and what should be their role and mandate. So it really is going back to that historic treaty relationship again and coming together with the Crown as represented by Canada about what that could look like in other territories.
Do you know if do you know if treaties are taken into account in municipal affairs and in the provincial government level?
Yes, the provinces are, through their delegated authority from the federal government, they are obligated to have that consideration, but it may not always be there. Like it has to be a conscious consideration, an intentional one, that everything they do, they should be asking, what role does treaty have in this process? I don't believe that question is always asked. Otherwise, we would not have issues around land entitlement claims and other resource management issues and the trapping and the fishing and the hunting court cases that we have. So I think there's a lot of complexities around the relationship now, because the relationship includes First Nations, the Crown, as well as the provinces, because of this delegated authority from the federal government.
Thanks for sharing. What was that one part of your last answer, which was when the municipal and provincial meeting rooms have to ask themselves, does treaty play a role in this process? Was that the question? I just want to have you say that again so everybody can write it down on a sticky note and then carry it around with them so they can constantly ask themselves that question.
Yes, that's exactly the question. At any table, to say, what role does treaty have in this process?
What role does treaty have in this process?
Yeah, do treaties have in this process? So they can be brought back to the original spirit and intent of those treaties, and have that consideration and avoid complications, and come to a place of mutual understanding, which might not take an hour or 2 hours. It might take a number of meetings, because people are only beginning to be open, I believe, to learning about the significance of history in terms of the treaties today, and that historic relationship.
Thank you, Cynthia. I would like to thank everybody who has come out to today's meeting. Your participation is absolutely necessary, so take what you've learned today and go out and share it. Tell 1-2 people in your family, your school, your workplace, and we can and by start I mean continue sharing treaty education. Thank you.